I know.
Okay.
She does the translation to the Houston area.
Jennifer. Damon. Nice to meet you.
Joseph Cologne.
Damon.
Joseph Cologne.
Joseph. Nice to meet you. What organization are y'all with?
I'm actually getting a master's in nonprofit management.
Awesome.
I do a lot of community outreach and so I'm just here trying to further my knowledge on the background of finance and education. I'm his assistant.
Nice.
What about you?
I'm in Leadership ISD this year.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a few people here.
Excellent.
The camera?
Yes, yeah, that's the camera. It's just a monitor. When we were at Leadership ISD,
Yeah, they were. I was not at that one. But I did tour a school up there, a newer one with like the woodworking and the
CTE Center by the hospital. Two-story building.
yeah, new with all the vocational.
CTC,
Really
yes.
cool. Yeah. That was pretty state of the art. How are you?
Doing good.
How's it going, Marnie? Oh, really? Okay. All right.
That's something that signed up.
There's a lot of traffic.
Well, I want to welcome you and honor everyone's time in this room, and thank you for coming out here on this Thursday night. We welcome you on behalf of Leadership ISD, and a special welcome in a second from BakerRipley as well. And we appreciate you being here for students in the city of Houston. We have a fun event where you will be able to talk with each other, most importantly connect at your tables with each other, and with an objective on a common goal at the end to send messages to the Senate Education Committee, who miraculously happen to be meeting right now. So when we planned this event, it was on a Thursday, and that committee normally meets on a Tuesday. But our messages are going directly to folks who are meeting and their staffers. So it's really important, the conversation we're going to have tonight, but I also want to let BakerRipley just kind of welcome us into the space that they've let us use this evening.
Good evening. Hi. Hiya. Are you happy to be here? Yes. Good, because we're happy to see you. Welcome to BakerRipley. My name is Anastasia Lindo Anderson, and I am the superintendent of schools for Promise Community School District, which is a feature part of BakerRipley. BakerRipley is a community development organization. How many people have actually been here before? Oh, do I need to tell you what BakerRipley does?
Yes.
Yeah? Maybe?
Yes.
BakerRipley is a community development organization that works in the community to help our neighbors reach their aspirations. In so many ways, we provide services such as senior services, such as public sector solution services, such as immigration, voting, social, emotional, mental health services, education services, from birth all the way through adult. There are many, many different services that belong within this amazing organization. I think it really is such a unique organization. I don't know too many across the United States that do the work that BakerRipley does. I don't want you to think I'm biased. But our CEO is Claudia Aguirre Vasquez, and Claudia is just awesome. So if you ever have an opportunity to come to any BakerRipley event and hear our CEO, you'll catch the vision and the spirit of what we do in the community. As the superintendent of schools, it's my pleasure to run a community school. A community school is a place and a set of partnerships that support children learning, but it also supports the families in becoming academic partners to help their children. So this is a gym of our school during the day, and it's a community space in the evening. Often our families come with so many needs in an urban area. We know a lot of what happens in spaces where some of our children are just struggling academically. And to work in a place like this, when a child is struggling, it's wonderful to have the Parish Foundation just up the hall that can come and can meet with the families, but also meet with students. Right across from our 3rd and 4th grade classrooms, we have Texas Children's Clinic, and so some of our families can visit Texas Children's when they have physical needs. Our families can get their taxes done here. Our families with grandparents can have their grandparents in the building during the day while their kids are also here during the day learning. It is just an awesome, awesome concept. And if you let me tell it, if I had predicting abilities, I really believe in the urban space we're going to see more concepts like this develop. Anyhow, thank you for letting me share that with you. Welcome to tonight. If anything, hopefully in sharing that concept, I've laid a little bit of the foundation of why school reform is so necessary, right? We've never funded schools adequately, and as schools take on more of the urban issues, we need the type of funding that allows us to do the work successfully. Welcome.
Thanks, Anastasia. So also welcome from Leadership ISD and my 2 teammates in Leadership ISD in Harris County, our regional director, Petra, who's back there, and Kimberly, who is helping check folks in, so welcome on behalf of all 3 of us. So like I said, tonight is about sending these messages to state legislators. It's about connecting each other at our own tables and realizing that there are a lot of like-minded folks who care about education in the city who might not be connected yet, and who, with that connection, can send powerful messages to what's going on literally in Austin right now. Because the way that our state funds public education is wholly inadequate, and right now as the legislative session winds down, with folks from the Texas House and the Texas Senate saying that education is so important throughout the session, 2 things are really important to note right now. The first is that the finish line for any comprehensive bill has not been crossed. And the second is that messages that we send, including tonight, have an impact on what eventually gets passed. As noted from staffers of any legislative office, the messages that you send have an impact. So tonight's about making sure that our voice gets heard. And surely there are things that are happening throughout all of the Harris County public school systems. But unless we adequately and equitably fund the schools in this county, we aren't going to set any board or any school system up for success. So Leadership ISD tries to ensure that that happens. And the way that Leadership ISD does that, as a couple of fellows in this room could also tell you, is that we equip diverse leaders through our fellowship. So we run a Civic Voices Fellowship, where we get 40 civic leaders, business leaders, folks from all sorts of industries together throughout the year to learn about issues in education and become better advocates. In fact, you're in luck if you haven't heard of Leadership ISD and are considering applying, because we extended the deadline and there are now 3 extra days to apply to our program if you just go to leadershipisd.org. And you'll be able through that program to do and put on events like tonight. At your table there is a practicum fellow, a fellow who's participating in a practicum that's going to facilitate conversation this evening and help to put on tonight as part of their participation in the fellowship. Another thing that we do is that we ensure public action. So consider this one of those events where we try to get more folks in the public engaged and actually activated. Where at the end of any night that we meet, we want to take an action, which we'll do tonight. And finally, we elevate school boards. So we do governance trainings, and we talk about the importance of school boards within our region and equitable governing practices. And that goes beyond the the largest school district in the state, and HISD, because there are 24 school districts in our county with 168 school board trustees, and an abysmal 11% of turnout for those elections to elect those trustees. So we try to bring more awareness to that. Most of our work is at the local level, but Leadership ISD also, with events like today, focuses a bit at the state level too. With impacting over 900,000 folks within Harris County. So kind of the meat of tonight is sending these messages to senators, but we don't want to send any messages uninformed. And so we have quite the treat actually this evening, and we'll start off with hearing and informing about what's going on in Austin from David Thompson. Now, David Thompson's bio online, if you looked it up before this evening,
Please don't read it.
Says in the second sentence that he is a frequent speaker on a variety of school law subjects at legal and educational meetings. So thank you for being a speaker at this educational meeting. And Mr. Thompson has had an incredibly active role in the world of school finance, arguing himself in critical court cases in our state's history, including the West Orange Cove CISD versus Neely case, where he successfully argued before the Supreme Court of Texas that the public education system at that time violated the Texas Constitution. Since then, there have been other lawsuits and other claims that is still going on, and part of the reason why there's so much focus in Austin around school finance. So he's going to have the gift of him being here. He'll walk us through what's going on in Austin right now, and then we'll enjoy a meal together and send the messages to him tonight after some conversation. Let's welcome Mr. David Thompson.
Well, thank you, Gregory, and Leadership ISD, and thanks to all of you after, I'm sure, long days for coming out for this important civic conversation. And Anastasia and BakerRipley, thank you very much for hosting this and for all the great work that is done not only in this community, but actually several other communities around Harris County. I'm always honored and appreciative to have the chance to speak to my fellow citizens who care about how we fund and take care of our students and our schools and prepare future leaders who one day will take their places in all of our different communities. So a couple of questions. Are anybody here teachers? Any teachers? Anybody administrators, principals or other administrators, school board members, parents, great, taxpayers. You were once a student yourself. Anybody here lawyers? Got a few of those. Man's in our law firm. Glad to see you and Hillary here tonight. The point is, we all have a lot of different hats that we wear, but a place where a lot of these different roles intersect is in our schools. And I'm going to start a little bit about school funding with our Texas Constitution. Article 7, Section 1 of our Constitution, which has not been changed since 1876, starts off with this great idea that a general diffusion of knowledge being essential to the preservation of the liberties and rights of the people. It shall be the duty of the legislature of the state to establish and make suitable provision for the support and maintenance of an efficient system of public free schools. There's a lot packed into that one kind of run-on sentence. And Hillary, if you were teaching legal writing, you would probably say break that into 2 or 3 sentences. But that's a very 19th century idea that is also still a modern idea. This idea that a healthy democracy is connected to an educated citizenry. Kind of makes sense. That's why we have schools. We don't have schools to give people jobs. We don't have schools to keep kids off the street. Those are good things. My daughters are both teachers, and I'm glad they have jobs. We have schools because this fundamental idea that a healthy society, a healthy democracy, and an educated citizenry go hand in hand. And so we use language that we don't use anywhere else in our Constitution. We talk about a duty of the legislature. That's pretty unique. We don't use this language when we talk about other services that we all appreciate as citizens. We don't use this language when we talk about roads or bridges or police or fire, but we use it when we talk about schools because of this connection to a healthy democratic society. So the legislature actually has a constitutional duty to set up a school system and then take care of it, as the 19th century language says, to support and maintain it. And so we occasionally have had litigation over the years. I've been involved in a fair amount of it, frankly arguing about whether the legislature is doing that duty or not, or if it should be done better. What we're dealing with right now in the 86th session is frankly something that's a little unusual. In my experience in the last 30 years or so dealing with the legislature, this is really the first time that I've seen the legislature take on major changes to our school funding system absent a court order. I mean, I think that's actually kind of good news, that they're doing it because they think it's the right thing to do and not simply because a court is saying you have to focus on it again. And I think candidly it's also getting an attention because of something that happened in November 2018. Elections have consequences. And there were a lot of educators and people that care about schools who spoke and whose voices were heard in November of 2018. And I think that message carried somewhat into this legislative session. Now here's where we are in our session. Texas, and how many of you have been to Austin during the legislative session? For somebody who has been involved in litigation with our legislators, I always want to put in a word on behalf of the men and women who serve in these roles. These are hard jobs. They're not highly compensated. Certainly by this point in the session, if you're up there, you will see people in their offices by 7 in the morning, and you'll see people still in committee meetings at midnight and working, putting in long and diligent hours, trying to do good work for our community. But Texas is one of only 5 states that has a biennial session. We meet every other year, and we're the only large state. And not only do we meet every other year, we only meet for 140 days every other year, so we pack a lot of activity into a very short, intense period of time. And certainly one of the big issues is schools. Right now, in the current session, our legislature will end on May 26th. That's what's known as sine die, or just Latin for it's time to get out of here and go home. So all of the major work is going to happen literally in the next month, and honestly in about the next 2.5 to 3 weeks. The General Appropriations Bill, which actually is the bill that appropriates or sets aside money, is in conference committee right now. It will probably be late into May after other major bills have moved through the system. There are in the area of health and human services, roads, and different things, major pieces of legislation moving through. We are just now getting to the serious work on school funding, and again, as Gregory said, our timing today could not be more perfect. The bills to keep an eye on if you're going to contact your legislators. The House has passed, and by the way, there are 2 big issues that are kind of moving in tandem through this legislative session. There is a lot of focus and a lot of interest on how we actually improve funding for schools. give schools resources to address the needs of kids and hopefully help kids meet higher standards and be successful. Another big issue that you're going to hear talked about a lot is property tax relief. You've seen that in the media. These two issues are linked at the hip, and if you're watching the process, they're moving in tandem. Now, the interesting dance is the House and Senate have ranked those two issues differently. In the House, issue number one has been school funding. And property tax relief, although important, is issue number two. The House moved early and very successfully on school funding, House Bill 3, and are just now looking at the House Bill 2 and Senate Bill 2 tax relief issues. They will eventually move on those issues, but that's been their priority. The Senate was exactly the reverse. The Senate moved earlier on tax relief and is just now, today, with 32 days left in the session, having their first hearings over school funding. So both of these issues are very important. They are going to move in tandem. There will be ultimately a global compromise by the end of the session, and but the balance is going to be somewhere between competing priorities there. So the House Bill 1, which is the General Appropriations Bill, has set aside $9 billion that can be used for school funding and tax relief. So for both of those two issues. The Senate has also come to that same $9 billion, so the good news is we're not debating between the two bodies on what the total amount is. We do have some differences about how to divide it up. But I will tell you, in my experience, this is the first time that we've had a number as large as $9 billion on the table at one time. I'd rather argue over $9 billion than over 900 million. So it's not a bad problem to have, but that's where the real argument's going to be. The House version took out of that $9 billion, 2.7 billion to use for tax reduction, property tax reduction. It's called compression. That's just a fancy way to say we're going to replace local tax dollars with state dollars and kind of buy down or reduce property tax rates. So the House set aside $2.7 billion to be used for that purpose. They set aside $6.3 billion to be used for actual funding improvements in schools. The Senate is having their conversation today. We just have seen their version of House Bill 3, and if you know the process, the number may be the same, but they are substituting their ideas under the same number. So we're going to wind up with a House version of House Bill 3 that is kind of the House idea of how the money ought to be divided up, and we're going to wind up with a Senate version of House Bill 3 with the Senate ideas on how to divide up the money. And then they're going to go to conference committee and try to work out the differences. So our timing is pretty good. Here are the big issues, and does everybody kind of have a general sense? I don't want to misuse your time, but I also don't want to skip over something that's important. Do y'all have a general idea of how the school funding system works, or do you want a 5-minute review on that?
Can we have a 5-minute review? I'm doing live stream, so just in case anybody's here that's not able to.
All right, take 3 minutes. All right, here in very simple terms, 3 main questions. What are we trying to accomplish? How much does it cost? And how are we going to pay for it? Those are the policy questions that really underlie school funding. Our state has an elaborate system of formulas. People talk about them as being unintelligible. They're actually, most of them are not much more than Algebra 1 or Algebra 2 or relatively simple statistics, but they are really out of date. Many of our formulas have not been updated since the 1980s. I've told groups before that some of our formulas have not been touched since Ronald Reagan was president, the Berlin Wall was standing, and Merle Haggard had the #1 song. So they're a little out of date, and certainly one activity we ought to do is update those formulas. For any given district, you run the calculations through these various formulas, you come up with a total amount that district ought to be entitled to for its kids. And I'm going to use a very simple illustration. Think of this bottle as a school district's total entitlement. Now, if I'm a relatively poor district, and it doesn't mean I have poor kids, it's property value. If I don't have very much property value, I may only be able to fill a little of the glass out of local dollars. And the way the formulas work is the state then says, okay, then we'll come in and fill the rest of the bottle with state dollars. If I'm a little wealthier district, I can fill more of my bottle with local dollars, and the state puts in less state money. And if I'm a very wealthy district, I not only can fill my entire bottle with local dollars, it runs over, and the part that spills over is what is known as recapture or Robin Hood, if you've heard those terms. Now, here's a key thing that's an issue in our school funding system that causes it to get out of whack periodically. As local values go up, and I want to say as a homeowner in Houston, I've seen my values go up. I would much rather have my values go up than go down. I've worked in communities where values are declining. I'd rather have our problems than their problems. But what happens when values go up? The entitlement doesn't get bigger. We as taxpayers write a bigger check, but the district's entitlement doesn't go up. All that happens when values go up is a district can fill more of its bottle out of local money, and the state then says, well, great, we don't have to put in as much. And that's why the state share keeps going down. The state actually treats increasing local values as an indirect source of state money because you're freeing up state dollars. And that's kind of a fundamental structural issue that I think they're spending a lot of time talking about. And that's part of what the $9 billion is about, is to reverse that and try to get the state overall share back up a little bit. A couple of issues that are going to be the big differences between the House and Senate. When the Senate bill passes, and by the way, I think the Senate is going to vote out their version of the bill next week, probably next Wednesday. It'll move out of committee and then fairly quickly move out of the Senate because we've only got a few weeks left in the session. They will get to conference committee, and then they will go, frankly, behind closed doors and begin to work on what the differences are. The House version puts more money into what's called the basic allotment. And the basic allotment, you know, if you thought of any exercise, if you thought of painting and just kind of the first color that you put on before you start adding other layers, the basic allotment is your first building block. We then have adjustments for kids who are poor or ELL or handicapped or that have other types of particular needs. But the basic allotment is that fundamental building block. The House raises that basic allotment from a little over $5,000 to a little over $6,000. The Senate raises it to about $5,800. So the House version is better in terms of raising that basic allotment. And by the way, as you raise the basic allotment, that not only means schools get more money, it also means recapture goes down if you're in a district like Houston or other communities where we're paying recapture to the state. So that'll be an issue of difference between the two. How they treat teacher salaries is going to be a big difference. The Senate version is going to have an across-the-board $5,000 pay raise for teachers and librarians, no, teachers and counselors, teachers and librarians, but no raise for anybody else. So in other words, the burden's going to be on the district to decide whether it can find the money to give raises for anyone else in the school system. What the House did was, instead of ordering a particular raise, the House said out of all of the new money that we're putting in, you have to take at least 25% and use that to give an across-the-board raise for all full-time employees, teachers, other than administrators. But teachers, nurses, counselors, librarians, custodians, bus drivers, aides, anyone else would get an across-the-board raise of between $1,800 and $1,900, and then the House would have to, under the House plan, there would be other money that would have to be spent on salaries. So that's going to be a big point of difference, whether there's kind of a mandated raise for some employees, but not all employees, or whether the money is spread, frankly, more broadly, and there are raises for all employees who are working in the school system. That's going to be one of the big differences that you may want to think about how to weigh in on as you are making contacts. Another big difference is the House had a lot of debate, ultimately did not include in their bill what's known as a pay-for-performance provision. And how many of you, just based on what you know, are real fans of standardized testing? Anybody here? Okay. All right. Well, very good. You know, STARS, and I've worked with the state for years. I was actually general counsel at TEA once upon a time, so I have a lot of familiarity with state testing systems. And assessment is a legitimate thing to do. It's a legitimate thing to do in education and in other areas. The question is always, what are we going to do with the results and how much weight, and are we going to actually tie funding of schools to what third graders score on a standardized test? That's kind of the question. The House did not include that provision. I think the Senate is going to include that provision in their version of the school funding bill. They're going to have a component that ties a certain amount of funding to performance, and I think particularly to third grade reading. Yes?
So does that mean if they score higher, they'll get more money, or if they score lower, they'll get more money?
If they, the great question, what does that mean? The result of the intent is to say, if you score higher, you will get more money. So, I think that could be a policy debate all in its own right as to whether that's a good thing to do and whether we want to put that much weight on a standardized test on third graders. So that's going to be a big difference between the House and Senate bills. Both bills are going to include additional funding for pre-K, and I think there will be money there that can be used by districts to move more towards funding of full-day pre-K programs. Both bills are going to include, yes.
Is that going to be like the expansion grant model before, or is it more like a...
The question is it going to be an expansion grant, or is it going to be more of a formula component? Great question. You know, in the past, we funded pre-K with grants that you basically had to apply for. Some districts got them, some districts didn't get them. You weren't sure they were going to stick around, and in fact, the legislature has eliminated grants and left districts holding the bag. What they're doing in both versions is to actually create a formula element that can be used to fund pre-K. And so I think they're actually taking a good thoughtful approach to that. One thing both bills are doing that I really applaud the policy as well as the research underlying it. Something like 60% of our kids in Texas come from homes that qualify for free and reduced price lunch. That's who our future Texans are. If you're in a school with 20 or 25% low-income kids, that's a different challenge than if you're in a school with 80% low-income kids. Historically, we've kind of funded all of those as if there were no real distinctions. Both the House and Senate this time, I think one of the more creative things is to say there's going to, in essence, be an increase in the formula tied to concentrations of low-income kids. So as teachers, campuses, schools deal with higher concentrations, there actually will be more funding tied to that, and the weights will actually increase. I think that's kind of a complicated idea to implement, but I think it's one of the, to me, it's one of the more interesting and better ideas in there. One issue that's going to be very, very controversial is whether we use prior year values or current year values in the funding. And now we're really getting into the weeds on school funding, but it's an important issue because it controls about $1.7 billion. And the House and Senate are going to take different approaches to this. And I want to go back to my model. So when the state is looking and trying to decide what's the local share and what's the state share, do they use the current year tax numbers, or do they use the tax numbers from the prior year? What we've historically done in Texas is use prior year values. I personally think that's the right decision for a lot of policy reasons. Schools are already, right now, as we sit here today, developing budgets for next year. And of course, we don't even know what the tax rolls are for this year. We know what they were for last year. There's some predictability around that. We don't know the current year values yet. And the state doesn't know the current year values. So there are policy issues involved there. The big thing to know is the House stuck with prior year values. I think the Senate is going to switch to current year values. And the main reason why is going to current year values saves the state $1.7 billion. Why? Because the local values will be higher, and therefore it takes less state money to finish filling the bucket. The state's going to use that additional $1.7 billion not to improve funding for schools, but for further buy down of taxes. Why this is a big issue is in all of our metropolitan areas in the state, whether it's Houston, Alief, Aldine, Dallas, Houston, Austin, any area that is growing is going to lose money or see recapture increase by going from prior year to current, and it's going to shift money more to rural areas where you're not seeing the same growth that we're seeing in the urban, suburban, or metropolitan areas.
So I've heard two different points of view on this.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I've heard two different points of view on this. That would be a one-time increase. That's what some, but then others said no, it won't. It would benefit every single year.
Yeah, the question is whether this is a one-time issue or an ongoing issue. Think about it this way. 1 month, I don't have the money this month to make my car payment. So I don't make a payment this month. I push my payment to next month. Now next month, I either have to make 2 payments to get back on schedule, or I push next month's payment into the following month. And then the month after that, I keep, in other words, I just shift the cycle. That's functionally what going from prior year to current year, you get that one-time savings, but it doesn't compound over time. You'll simply be saving that same dollar every year in years after. Does that make sense? So you realize it really the first year, and then assuming you don't ever go back, this is really getting too arcane, I can tell, just looking. The big thing is, the big issue, the big point is it's 1.7 billion, that it would increase reliance in urban, suburban areas like Harris County, like all of Dallas County, like all of any urban or metropolitan area. You're gonna see the reliance on local property taxes go up, and it saves the state money that they can then spend in other areas. That's gonna be a big policy difference. I think they ought to stick with prior year values. I think just from working with districts on budgeting and knowing how school funding works, there's more stability and less instability by using prior year values. But that's going to be one of our central points of disagreement. So these are the big ones. There's a lot of commonality, but in the next couple of weeks, if you want to make your voice heard, how we handle the teacher's salary or all employee salaries, and all employees definitely need more money. We need great people in education who are well compensated for the hard and important jobs that they do. But there are going to be very different treatments between the House and Senate over the salary issue. The pay for performance issue is going to be one of the central big differences, and what I'm trying to flag are the ones where a lot of the money is. That's going to be one of the big points of difference, and then the current year, prior year is going to be one of the big points of difference between the bills as they go to conference committee. Again, a lot of good work has been done. I really do want to commend the legislators for a lot of the progress that's being made in terms of updating formulas, transportation formulas that haven't been touched since the 80s, pre-K funding, the funding for low-income kids. I mean, there are a lot of really strong, good ideas that are in this, but I think those are the ones where we're going to see real differences, and those are going to be the points that have to be worked out as we move towards that May 26th finish line. I hope I haven't overstayed. Do you want to take a few questions?
Yeah, that sounds perfect. Based on what you're hearing or what your knowledge historically of the legislature, with these differences, do you think these are going to be resolved at the end of the session, or are we heading for a special?
I think they are always capable of flying it into the ground. I never ever minimize that possibility. I do think this session, and particularly given that the total dollar amount is relatively similar, and there are so many similarities, I am cautiously optimistic that they will get it resolved before May 26th. I think the members, if you talk to the members, are very much committed to that. You're not hearing people digging in and saying, well, I guess we're going to be here this summer. You're not hearing those kind of conversations. I think there is a lot of good faith commitment to trying to get it resolved before the end of the session.
When it comes to recapture,
Yeah.
now it's on. When it comes to recapture, do you mind reviewing that conversation? How committed are either the House or the Senate to really looking at districts like HI?
Yep. Yep. All right, a little comment about recapture. Recapture was created in 1984 as a means just to deal with a small little spike of high wealth districts, mostly small districts in rural areas like the Permian Basin. Total amount of recapture statewide initially was $150 million. Now, recapture is over $3.5 billion with a B per year. Districts like Houston are paying close to $200 million of local property taxes that we're all paying, not being used in our schools. They're going to Austin and being put in general revenue. Austin is paying over $600 million of local property taxes every year to Austin, to the state, to use for state. The state unfortunately figured out this was a great revenue source. Just think about it. If you figured out a way to get money that you didn't have to take the heat for because all the local school boards were having to take the heat for it, but you got the benefit of it, that's a pretty good system. I think it's finally gotten to the point where you have so many districts that are in recapture, and you have particularly large urban districts with large populations of poor children. Dallas moved into recapture this year for the first time. So I think that is kind of broken through and is going to get a lot of legislative attention. It's not going to be eliminated, but I could see recapture being reduced by at least 50% out of this session. The real key is going to be keeping it down historically going forward and not letting things revert to how they used to be.
Greetings. Thank you for your
He's got the
time.
microphone.
I'm an A-Leaf ISD parent and taxpayer, and I want to know if you could give us some insight on how to hold our districts accountable for the money that they receive.
Yeah, how do we hold districts accountable for the money they receive? Great question. Districts, any of our boards right now, and I will promise you every one of them, and we have a trustee from A-Leaf. Y'all are probably going through budget conversations right now. Those are public meetings. They're posted. They're advertised. I think most of our districts in this area stream those on the internet. A lot of good information is being provided about how money is going to be allocated in the budgets. Those ultimately will be adopted by boards. Most of the bigger districts in our area will have to adopt their budgets by June because July 1 is a new fiscal year. And then the budget information about how money is spent is publicly available. There's nothing about that information that's private. So it's always going to be accessible.
Well, my concern is that my superintendent says that they have the ability to make data say whatever they want it to say. So I really want to know how to hold them accountable for the money, not just what they say they're doing for the money.
And what I'm saying is accountability, you're going to have to educate yourself and go through the process with them and understand. And the ultimate accountability, frankly, is at the ballot box. But boards can only spend money in accordance with lawfully adopted budgets or amended budgets. That's by law. So the budget process is if you're really interested in how are our dollars being allocated, I would be paying attention over this period of months as those budgets are being developed, and you're having a lot of detailed conversations at board tables about how much do we put into salaries, how much do we put into health insurance, how much do we put into you know, what do we think is happening on our insurance or our utility bills or whatever. And so that's really where you're gonna get that information.
Let's take 3 more questions because I can smell the
Right.
pizza. So,
And yeah, we can all smell the pizza, you know.
Can you talk a little bit about where they're going to find the money to fund this?
Yeah.
Is it the permanent school fund or other?
Yeah, where does the money come from? At the state level, you know, we in Texas, we don't have an income tax. We're not going to have an income tax anytime in the near future. If you think about tax policy in the whole history of mankind, there are 4 taxes.
Okay.
There's taxes on what you use, we call those sales taxes. There's taxes on what you own or what belongs to you, we call those property taxes.
Thank you.
There are taxes on what we produce, we call those income taxes. And then there used to be taxes, think of the Roman Empire, just existed. You know, just because you're alive and you take up a spot on this planet, you have to pay a tax. We don't levy that tax, so we're really looking at production, income, or use and ownership. And we're not gonna have an income tax, so we're really focused in Texas on sales tax. You've heard conversation in the last few days about potentially raising the sales tax rate in Texas. We have a high sales tax, we have relatively broad exemptions, we have a high rate, and we have higher property taxes than most other states. We depend on those 2. We are also very, very dependent in Texas at the state level on oil and gas severance taxes. When production is up and oil prices are good, we all look smart. When production is down and prices are down, you don't look as smart. Right now in Texas, production is up. If you followed what's happening in the Permian and other producing areas, our biggest issue, frankly, is how to get the oil and gas out of the West Texas fields into the markets, and there's a lot of talk about major pipeline expansion, et cetera. But we're dependent very heavily on oil and gas severance, sales, and then level property taxes.
I want to return quickly to the question about budget and accountability. A quick statement and then a question for you, Mr. Thompson.
First, I guess it's going in and out.
Okay. First is that the term that you want to be very familiar with, efficiency study or performance audit.
Every local government agency is required to, okay, all right. I'll just stand up and talk. Every local government agency is required to conduct an audit that says that they're spending the money the way they're saying they're spending the money. That's great, but what should be important to us as taxpayers is how efficiently they're spending the money and whether or not it's being used in the right way. Right? So are they spending too much on one thing versus another? HISD last year approved a performance audit of their budget to be conducted by the Legislative Budget Board for the first time in 25 years, which is entirely too long. So if you're worried about your own district or any government agency, you could just Google performance audit or efficiency study and then the name of whatever that agency is to find out when the last time they actually checked how well they're spending the money that they're using. My question for you is, because I actually field this question all the time, where is the LBB in its work in HISD, and when will we find out the results?
LBB has conducted, to my knowledge, all of their own site interviews at HISD. HISD is the largest entity that the LBB has ever performed a performance review of. It is, one of the largest districts in the state, in the country. They've conducted, to my knowledge, they've finished their all of their own site interviews and data collection, and they're in the process of doing the analysis and the development of the final report and recommendations.
Okay.
And frankly, I'm hopeful that we will see that before we finalize our budget this year. If the information is really going to be useful, we need to see it before we finalize the budget. That's what I hope.
I want to go back to recapture for a minute. It's obviously a hot topic, and I'm actually a really big fan of it. It's definitely a model of equity, right? But in thinking about how they're reducing it right now, have there been conversations about actually changing the threshold at which a district is kind of thrown into recapture? Is that part of the long-term plan for reducing the amount of overall recapture across the state?
Yeah. There are two ways to reduce recapture, and I want to say this: recapture is it's an equity feature in our system because it pulls down the richest. It doesn't necessarily redistribute those dollars to the poor. That is a false assumption. It is more Robin than it is Robin Hood, if you think about it that way. My big problem with recapture is it's become something it was never intended to be. It was intended to deal with a relatively small spike of extremely high wealth. And once the state kind of figured out the game, it has become a revenue mechanism for the state as a whole. And districts like Houston and Austin and Dallas and others, but with large populations of needy kids, were never intended to be in recapture, and that is simply a misuse of the system. But there's two ways to reduce recapture. One is to pull it down and just say we're not going to do it. We're not going to pull as much down from the top. And I'm not really in favor of that. Of that approach. The other way to reduce recapture is to raise the bottom. That's the smart way to do it. And if the state had been raising the bottom for school funding just in incremental amounts over the years, we wouldn't even be having the conversation we're having about recapture, and the system would be more equitable. Here's something to think about of how we deal with school funding, because we deal with it in kind of a catharsis and then out of mind cycle. If any of us over the upcoming Memorial Day weekend mowed our yard, trimmed our flower beds, got everything looking just perfect, and then didn't touch your yard again till Labor Day, it would look pretty bad and your neighbors would be pretty unhappy with you. That's how we've tended to approach school funding historically in Texas. We'll have these kind of cathartic times where we deal with it, and then everybody says, okay, good, we don't have to think about that for a few years, and things get out of whack again. But recapture is an equity measure. I firmly disagree with anybody who says, oh, it's working the way it's supposed to be working. It isn't. It's become something it was not intended to be. But I think the way you address it responsibly is to raise funding for all districts that improves the equity of the system and simultaneously reduces recapture.
Let's thank David for joining us.
Thank you all. And I appreciate all the work all of you are doing.
David, we have a tradition at Leadership ISD to give every one of our speakers a journal. And now you have your official Leadership ISD journal, so thank you so much for joining us. Another round of applause. So much like at our sessions, after hearing some information, we get to talk about it in our community tables. But I also smell the pizza. And so at your community table, there will be a fellow who leads the conversation in just a second. That conversation can begin as soon as everyone is back at the table with their pizza and drink. So enjoy the food. I did say meal earlier. I didn't mean to mislead anyone. There wasn't carrabba's brought in. It's just pizza, but still in the Italian vein. So enjoy that. And we'll start with just this first row here. As soon as everyone's back at your table, the fellows can start the conversation. So table 6, 5, 4, and 3. Go ahead.
No. Those of us in the ledge group, we're supposed to be doing these things. Not a bunch of us. No, he meant that. I just look at. Darn, I'm not even doing that. Did you get my email? So, I don't know. No. I keep right back there.
Okay, I'm pretty sure I added you, but it's like it's MailChimp, so something's supposed to say.
Hi, Elena.
Okay, so I've been kicked away from my only table just to be here.